Hi everyone, welcome to Watch It Play Table Talk Back. My name is Rodney Smith and we're going to be continuing our discussion on how we value games and specifically how we value the contribution of designers to a game. And I wanted to start with a comment from Seth, the donator who helped sponsor this discussion topic. He says, I do not think that publishers should just raise the amount of royalties they pay to designers. They can't afford to do that. The pricing of games is based almost entirely on manufacturing, artwork, and shipping. And I suspect consumers would not tolerate an increase in prices to cover larger royalties. The question is, how much value do you get from game content? Given two games with similar components, how much more money would you pay for a game you love versus one that is just okay? I think what Seth is asking us to consider here is how we evaluate the price tag when we see it on a box. I've been in a game store before, picked up a game and thought, this is kind of light, especially based on the size of this box, and then looked at the components on the back, and then the price tag, and it felt like $60 for this? This feels like maybe the publisher's trying to gouge me here. But what I'm really evaluating at that point is the components that are in the box. I'm saying this doesn't feel like $60 worth of components. But is that what I'm buying here? Am I buying a toy or am I buying a game? And is there things that cannot simply be evaluated by the weight and the look of the components? And I think what Seth is asking us is the game design also part of the value that comes in that box? And therefore, part of what should be involved in that price and how we assess our feelings towards that price when we see it. Scott Nicholson, the designer of the upcoming game Going, Going, Gone, and much beloved host of Board Games with Scott, had this to say: game design is an art. I cringe when I hear, I could just make it myself for a few bucks, so why should I buy it? It's like saying, why should that painting be worth thousands of dollars? It's not even $10 in components. Heck, I could just paint that myself. Part of buying a game is rewarding the people who created the art, and the art, as Scott said in this case, is that game design. One of the challenges, I think, for game designers in being compensated for their contribution is, well, I think we would pay more for a good quality game design, but it can be hard to assess that from a closed box before you've had a chance to try the game. You think about art, like Scott says, and that can fetch a very high value. But you can go into a gallery and look at a painting, assess the feeling of how that painting connects to you, and that can help grease the wheels before you fork over that thousands of dollars for what amounts to maybe $10 in components, even if you ignore the fact that there may be immense talent behind that painting. But let's run with this notion for a bit. Phil Hatfield says, I really don't pay attention to who the designer of a game is. I pay attention to if the game is fun to play. If it is, I play it, and I recommend it to other people. If the game isn't fun, it doesn't matter if it was made by the best designer out there or a completely new designer. I won't play it more and I won't recommend it. There are a lot of different ways to evaluate the quality of a game, but one of the most common things that people look for is that fun factor. And that's a very elusive, subjective thing to try to assess, especially before you've paid the money and tried the game yourself. But like artwork, there are other ways to assess the value of the game and its enjoyment to you besides paying for it. Matthew Kuzman, 39, says, I only ever buy games based on the gameplay reviews and/or experience I've had with it. I've never understood why anyone puts any time or attention into reviews of a game's production quality. Now, I do understand why production quality matters. I've played games that I enjoy that I feel have been hampered by components that were either a nuisance or fiddly to play with or just were poor quality. And I've seen a good game elevated to great simply because the components were also great. But I think what Matthew's getting at here is there are other ways to evaluate a game besides actually paying for it up front. Kenneth Love echoes this when he says, I've noticed that as I've moved through the hobby, I've stopped looking at designers or art or publishers, and I put more attention on playthroughs, like yours, Watch It Played, and Rado's for making my decisions. The value of a game comes from the enjoyment of it, not any one part of the whole. By looking at reviews and playthroughs and trying games at your local game store or a friend's copy, you can see if a game is a good fit. One of the main reasons why I created Watch It Played is because, personally as a gamer, I was having difficulty evaluating what it would feel like to play a game that I was interested in. And I was getting a lot of great information from reviews, but sometimes I just needed that little something more. And so I wanted to create an opportunity for people to have that kind of vicarious experience by watching us play the game and then be able to see, without having to pay up front, whether or not that game was the kind of gameplay that they were looking for. Publishers who think that the market won't be kind to the price tag that they put on a game based on the components alone may want to consider getting their game out to conventions, have it demoed at retail shops, and if you'll permit me a little bit of self-promotion, have their games featured on shows like ours, where consumers can see the gameplay and start to better assess the value of the game design for themselves. Chris Brown says, "I don't pay extra at the movie theater because the movie took more money, time, or skill to make. I believe there should be a set amount from each copy that goes to the designer. If they did a good job, then they will sell a lot of copies and make money. If it's a bad game, then they won't. Volume is everything." I actually agree with Chris here to some extent. One of the challenges, of course, is that movies sell millions and millions of copies in terms of tickets sold, whereas a successful print run on a game may be 3,000 to 10,000 copies, which, when you look at royalties in that case, isn't a lot to offer to a designer. And listen, Chris, it's not your fault that board games aren't as popular as movies. But as someone who really enjoys this hobby, I want to see board game designers be able to thrive in this industry. So I'd love to be able to find a more immediate solution than having to have them go to Hasbro to sell many copies. And really great games sometimes are more complex than what the majority of gamers are going to want to pick up. So a good game isn't necessarily one that sells to the masses. It's a difficult situation. Here, Peter Evans says, "I do pay attention to the designers, but almost every designer puts out a turd every once in a while too. They can't just ride the reputation that they once built." Peter, I agree with you. I probably should have been more clear about this. I don't think that consumers should just buy a box because of the designer's name that's printed on the front of it. But rather that, for myself personally, I am starting to value game design more and more. I've been taken in by the flash and the presentation of a game and its components. But if there's not a good game design at the core of it, then I don't care for the game. And that design is coming from designers. So I am starting to pay more attention to who these designers are. And I think as more discerning board game consumers pay attention to the designers, then publishers will see that and they'll realize that signing on these good designers helps them stand out in this market. And so hopefully they'll pay a higher premium to those designers based on a good quality track record, which is one way for them to get better compensation. I think Jesuel Demoisine really sums up nicely, saying, "I think designers have to take it on the chin a bit until they are an established force. Think of all the painters whose paintings fetch millions today, who were impoverished during life. Starting up these days is the same. It's all about publicity and getting your name and product out, known and cherished. It will take a while, but eventually the good designers will rise to the top." As I showed with Bruges, valuable marketing space is being taken up on the box to highlight who the designer is, and I think that's a sign. The publishers are recognizing that as consumers we do care about design, and that the track record of a good designer will help encourage us to consider a game beyond simply the components themselves, but also the game design inside of that box. Patrick Doss says, "Yes, the consumer needs to realize that a box full of cards also has been properly tested and planned out and developed to make those cards into a great game. But consumers don't want to just buy a bunch of rules either. It's simply a matter of form working with function." I agree with you, Patrick, because as much as I want to see game design valued above other elements, I think we do a real disservice to a great game by shortchanging the components. Ian O'Toole writes, "The underlying issue is that the board game industry, while being very small, demands outstanding quality while expecting low prices. As an artist and graphic designer who has worked on board games, I never make even half of my otherwise typical hourly rate on game art. As a creator and a consumer, I'd like to see games become more expensive. I realize everyone has different limits, but it wouldn't bother me too much if games were $20 more expensive across the board. On a sold-out run of 3,000 games, that's an additional $60,000 in revenue. Not a huge amount, but would go some ways towards compensating the creators. It would also make consumers far more discerning about where they spend their money, which would hopefully lead to far less mediocre game releases. You know, one of the things I just really appreciate about the discussions that we get to have here is the variety of different points of view that we receive, and no matter where people stand, the thoughtfulness in which they are presented. You know, Paul Renato here, for example, takes a slightly different approach to Ian's. He says, I value the designers. I also value publishers who consistently put out great games, but I think that we've got to a point where the prices are getting much more abusive. Games costing more than 50 to 60 euros is too much, but not just expensive games. A game like Love Letter that I really like, 10 euros for 16 cards and some wooden cubes is a bit much, because the other aspects mentioned, while valuable, they just don't justify the percentage increase in the final price. You see, I think this is one of the challenges that publishers face because, you know, I look at Kickstarter and I will see a game that is packed full of miniatures, but there's no game design to speak of. We haven't been given rules, we haven't been given gameplay videos or anything, and these are making hundreds of thousands of dollars before anyone gets a sense of what the gameplay is actually like. And I worry because I feel like we're sending kind of a dangerous message to publishers. We're saying, we don't care about the game design. We don't care how good the game is. We will throw money at it if it looks good. And at the same time, we're saying, listen, if you're going to charge me $60 and you're going to try to sell it on the fact that the game is really fun and good to play, that's not going to be enough. It is really challenging because at the same time, I understand as a consumer, I really do like all those shiny bits and pieces. I do want all those crazy great components, and that will draw me in. Sometimes where good game design doesn't appeal to the instincts that I have to want to pick something up. Keith Collins says, I tend to look at a game's gameplay, components, and overall wow factor when I'm thinking about making a purchase. Then I decide if the game seems to be a bargain to me, or if I find it to be overpriced. Then I will think about relative value to what I may spend on something else. Will I enjoy this more than a $60 video game? Will I get more use out of this than a $35 lunch for two at Applebee's? If I can drop $5 for a latte that I drink in 10 minutes, I can drop $60 on a game, no problem. I remember when Risk Legacy was first announced and it had a $60 price tag, and there was some backlash because the game could only be uniquely played 15 times. Now, ignoring the fact that, of course, you could play it beyond that, just like you would a regular Risk game. But even still, if you take 15 plays, divide that into $60, you're looking at $4 per play. And each game is probably on average at least an hour long. And you're gonna, if we assume you're playing with 3 other people, then that's $1 per play per person. And at the time, and even now, that game has been considered highly innovative in terms of its game design, especially for something coming out of Hasbro. And so do we not value that? Would we not be willing to pay more than $1 per play session of that? As Keith says, well, we'll pay much more for a warm drink. It may be a challenge to get board game consumers to assess value in games the same way that they value other forms of entertainment that they more willingly throw money at. And believe me, I include myself in this. I feel equally challenged by this whole idea of how I value game design. But I'd just like to wrap this up with a statement and a quote provided by Njejuel Demoisin. When you pay too much, you lose a little money. That is all. When you pay too little, you sometimes lose everything because the product you bought is incapable of doing what it was bought to do. The common law of business prohibits paying a little and getting a lot. It just can't be done. And here's the quote that was provided. There's hardly anything in this world that someone can't make a little worse and sell a little cheaper, and people who consider price alone are that man's lawful prey. That was by John Ruskin, who lived 1819 to 1900. Listen, I want to thank everyone again for contributing to this discussion. Whether you got featured in the episode or not, I read all of those responses, and it's just, again, a variety of thoughtful, civilly presented points of view. And I want to thank Seth as well for providing us with this challenging discussion topic. We also have a video response I want to share with you. And until the next episode, thanks for watching.
I'd like to say that I am not like you. The things I look at are the theme. Is the theme good? Now for me, good themes are spaceships and dragons in a dungeon. If it's got those themes, it's halfway to being bought. If the theme is gangsters vying for control, and then it's the mechanics. Do the mechanics do something which is different to other games that I have. So yeah, I may have 3 or 4 dungeon games like Munchkin and Hero Quest. They're both dungeon games, but they do the thing different. The other thing I look for is components. If the components are good, that again helps towards me wanting to purchase the game. Also, I look at reviews on telly. I look at Mr. Vassal, I look at Bearded Guy, Viking. And I decide for myself whether it's a game that I would like, and does it fill a hole in my, not my collection, but in the games that I've got. Does it make me want to play it? My wife has a different method for selecting games. If the box art looks nice, she'll buy it. So there you go, Rodney. I don't look for a particular make or a particular designer. I look at the game overall. The last contributing factor is how much money I've got in my pocket, or how much money my wife will let me spend.